Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank you. I want to thank all the folks on the floor from the parliamentarian's office, the floor clerks, for spending the night on this important effort. I want to thank you and your colleagues for occupying the chair, something I had the privilege of doing for the last 2 years. I want to thank my colleagues, particularly Senator Murphy, who's working the night shift along with Senator Schatz. And I share the concerns that I've heard Senator Murphy express about the peril of our democracy and the peril of the people that all of us represent. You know, my view here is that January 6th is not over. I was here that day, as I know you were, Mr. President, and Senator Murphy was. And I remember taking a walk in the morning from the Capitol right here, down past the Ellipse, where the President later that day spoke, to the Washington Monument, and then down to Lincoln Memorial. And I didn't have a sense of dread or anticipation of what ultimately happened that day. There were lots of people here who were supporters of President Trump. You know, I was looking at them as American citizens. I was nervous a little bit about the signs that were so aggressive. Hang Mike Pence, seeing a gallows that was put up outside the Capitol, seeing the signs about killing Nancy Pelosi. And but I had an assumption that I think all of us had, is that it would be peaceful and orderly, and I never ever anticipated that there would be a direct attack by a mob on the Capitol. And I don't think any of us were. On the other hand, my walk had ended before then President Trump, in his last days of office, he had 14 more days, had his rally at the Ellipse and encouraged people. He had invited them to come here and go wild. He said that he won the election. He had feverish activity in a number of states to try to assert that it was false electors. He filed, I don't know, 60 or 70 lawsuits, and they were all set aside, I think, except one on a minor technicality. The courts defended the outcome of the election. There was never any evidence that there was significant fraud that in any way affected the outcome of the election. That's not me saying it. That was then Attorney General Barr coming to the conclusion that there was no evidence whatsoever that there was widespread fraud or any kind of fraud that was substantial enough to affect the outcome of the election. So you had 67, 8, maybe 70 courts that rejected all the arguments that the Trump team made. You had his own Attorney General reject it. But despite that, you had intense efforts on the part of President Trump to convince people that he won when he lost. And it got so extreme that he got on the phone with the Secretary of State of Georgia and asked him to find him 11,000 plus votes to reverse the outcome of the election. He actually asked the Secretary of State to completely violate his oath of office and, quote, find me the votes. You just don't do that when your job, more than anything else as the President of the United States, is to respect the process of the citizens voting for who the next president will be. And that didn't stop after January 6th. When he got feverish calls from highly respected leaders here in the Capitol, Mr. President, you got to do something. That was after the invasion of the Senate, when Vice President Pence was actually in quite a bit of danger. In the stories are told that when the president was told that at the White House, he said, why do I care? And that attitude persisted. It just went on and on and on. And while the president was in the White House, watching TV, watching things unfold, and there was incredible violence here. Many of us were in the building, and I'll tell that story. I was in the house, and I was in the gallery. And the reason I was in the gallery as opposed to on the floor is, that, of course, that was COVID, so there was social distancing. So we were doing our business both in the floor and in the gallery. The gallery is probably the worst place to be in some ways because you couldn't get in and out with any kind of ease. And what I so vividly remember was a couple of things. One, we had the speaker in the chair, and we had no idea what was going on outside. You know, it was on TV apparently, but we weren't watching it. We were watching the floor activities. And suddenly, the speaker was interrupted when a Capitol Police officer came on the floor and interrupted and shouted that the Capitol was under siege and we were to stay in place and that we were to take out the gas mask, breathing apparatus that were under the chairs and get ready to put those on. Now, one of the things we still have in the Senate and we had in the House was a sense of decorum. And there might be, in a fierce debate, some talking over one another on occasion, but the chair was always the person who was in charge. And suddenly, we had a police officer literally interrupting the proceedings of the House of Representatives. And I just thought to myself, how is this happening? And of course, he told us that we were under attack. We didn't know what that meant. I had taken that walk, a couple of hour walk earlier in the morning, and I saw a lot of very aggressive activity, but I thought it was peaceful. By the way, the one thing I did see that didn't mean all that much to me at the moment, but meant a lot to me after all the events unfolded, was there were about 3 groups of people that were marching in military formation, and they were singing anthems, which were pretty vulgar about what to do to Nancy Pelosi, but they were in a military lockstep. It was all civilians, or so I thought. But it was a formation that I later in the videos saw was used to overwhelm the Capitol Police who were at the gates, the racks that were surrounding the Capitol. All very, very premeditated and practiced. It was a military kind of formation. So when we were in the going back to the gallery, we were all mystified what to do. We were apprehensive, obviously. And right after that officer spoke, I saw a couple of other Capitol Police come to the leaders, Speaker Pelosi, Majority Leader Hoyer. I was watching that side of the room, and I think and Leader McCarthy as well, were just whisked out. They were just taken out. And then it was just silence, because the mob that ultimately attacked the House side had to get from this side of the Capitol, the Senate side over there. And we watched and waited. And one of the things, and then we tried to go back in session. And Congressman McGovern took the chair and tried to proceed. And I think part of it was that even though the police officer had told us that the Capitol was under attack, we wanted to get our job done. It was January 6th. We had to certify the election. It's a pretty easy job because our job is not to have a debate about who won the election. It's just to validate the vote of the citizens of the state we represent so that their will be officially recorded. And the person that the people of this country and all our 50 states elected will be certified. Very, very simple. And as Mr. McGovern was attempting to proceed, there was more and more alarm. And I watched as our security staff began taking heavy furniture and putting it up as a barricade against the doors. And the doors I'm talking about are the ones that, the iconic doors, where when the President of the United States is escorted to the well of the House to give an address to a joint session of Congress, with the great ceremony and tradition that we have, is escorted over by the Sergeant at Arms, and who announces with great fanfare, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. Well, those doors are barricaded. And at this point, we all began to hear battering at the doors, those very doors, banging and banging and battering. And then I saw something else I'd never seen. I saw our security staff with guns out. I'd never seen that. And the banging on the door and then eventually the shattering of glass on these doors on the house side that are right over there, the comparable ones. And I saw this pole coming through the door itself where the person with the pole had managed to shatter that glass. And there were a number of us up there in the house. And all of us had different levels of fear. And one of the fears that I think a lot of us had is that this is possibly a mass shooting event. All of us know that the tragedy of modern life in this country is that their mass shooting events are all too common. But this is one of the most vivid memories I have. I was standing there and having no idea what was going to happen, but seeing that the police had their firearms out and hearing the glass shatter. And as I was looking at this and I was feeling actually personally fearful, as we all were, I had another feeling that was even more dominant than my apprehension about our safety. It was disbelief. Even as I was watching, even as I was experiencing this attack, the breaking of glass, the banging on the doors, the security folks putting up barricades, having guns out, I didn't believe that it was happening. I didn't believe it. And the reason I didn't believe it is that this is the United States of America. We have been able to enjoy something that apparently we took for granted for our nearly 250 years, and that's the peaceful transfer of power. That's the renunciation of violence as a means of affecting the outcome of election. It was shattered that day on January 6th. So, of course, later we found out that there was a huge mob outside, and they did an immense amount of damage. I know they came over here and ransacked the Senate and some of the offices, including the parliamentarian. We had police officers who died. We had many of our Capitol Police injured. And I want to just talk about one police officer who was in the Capitol with me. It was a young man. He was probably about 35, and I'd been talking to him a little bit. He had 2 kids. He commuted into work, and as many of the folks who work here, they can't live close by. It's too expensive. And they work hard, but it's a tough grind. You've got to commute maybe an hour in heavy traffic, coming in, coming out, especially folks with a young family. And he was literally standing over me when I was on the floor with his gun out. And as you know, in the gallery, it's like in the Senate chambers, there are all these doors around the gallery, and they were not all secure, although we did have some Capitol Police up there. And the apprehension all of us had at that point was that there was going to be a mob coming through those doors and attacking us directly. And this officer, a young man, had his weapon out. And he was intently surveilling. And I could just see, or maybe I'm imagining, what was going through his mind. The last thing in the world he wanted to do, the last thing was to have to use that weapon on a fellow citizen who was in the Capitol. And I'm sure for all kinds of reasons. I mean, just think of the responsibility one has. If their job is to protect members of Congress and the staff, and in the doing of that job, you actually have to make a decision to use your sidearm. And how traumatic that would be for the officer if he, in fact, had to do it. This person who has a family, who's working hard, whose partner is expecting him home in a matter of hours. Maybe he's going to pick up the milk or pick up his kid at school on the way home. I mean, all the activities of everyday life. That's what is important to all of us. But what I could see is that as horrible as it would be for him to have to take that action, if that's what was required, and in my case, I was the one he was really protecting. He did not want to do it, but I could just see he was determined to do whatever was required to protect us. You know, that's the point where I really got disgusted with the people who were attacking. Because I was wondering, how is it, you know, I get it, you think your guy won, and you're over the top here. You're actually showing up at the Capitol, and you know, some were violent, a lot were really violent, others were less so, but they obviously were part of a mob scene here. But what disturbed me was the lack of capacity on the part of the folks attacking the Capitol to experience or empathize or see the impact that their actions were having on everyday Americans, not us in Congress. They don't like us. They don't think we represent them. I get that. But what I don't understand is how a grievance you may have against members of Congress on that day, or the vice president, or the actors who were going to actually do the certification, how you would allow yourself to be part of a group that did such harm to, in this case, that officer who was standing over me, to put him in such jeopardy, to cause him such anguish and trauma. You know, there's just no justification. We have an obligation to one another. As passionate as we may be about a political concern that we have, does it justify just treating with enormous disrespect, with physical violence, people who just aren't involved in it? They're just collateral damage. And then to think that while this was going on, President Trump was watching TV, and he was getting frantic calls from people like Kevin McCarthy, the leader, and others. Stop this. It's out of hand. You got to call him off. And he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. So that was a dark day. And it's not over. January 6th was the first time in our history where there was a mob attack like that on the Capitol by a group inspired by the President of the United States, where the purpose was to stop the really clerical administrative process of certifying, not electing, but certifying the victor of the election for President of the United States. And what the president's team had done is cooked up a bunch of theories, all of which were dismissed by the court, to make it a case that the electors should be rejected and substitute electors provided to get an outcome that the person who lost the election wanted in order to claim that he won the election. But the fact that the President of the United States, who is the custodian really, and the one most representative of the whole people of the United States, and the need and importance of us having traditional commitment to the peaceful transfer of power, was rejecting that and encouraging people to act against that tradition. And he did an effective job in persuading a lot of people who supported him. And in fact, many of the folks who came on January 6th later testified that they thought the president wanted him here, and they believed the president when he said the election was stolen. There's an immense amount of power in that office and in the person of Donald Trump. So a lot of people who came here thought they were doing patriotic work. And then, of course, the Senate and the House reconvened, and we did certify the election. But the dispute continued. And many in this House and many in the Senate voted against certification. In my view, without any justification whatsoever. But there was enormous turmoil among the people of our country, because a lot of folks did believe, inspired by President Trump's assertions, that the election was, quote, rigged. And then, of course, after the certification and even the swearing in of President Biden, the continuing assertion by President Trump was that the election was stolen. He never stopped that narrative. And I'm not enough of a historian to know if what happened on January 20th with respect to the inauguration was unique. But President Trump did not show up. He did not sit on the dais. And the tradition that we've had, of course, in this country as part of the peaceful transfer of power is that the outgoing president does sit on the dais and acknowledge the arrival of the new president elected by the people. And it's a wonderful ceremony because it reminds us that the power that a president has is derived from the will of the people. And it's temporary. It's while that person is in office. They hold the power of that office until they don't. So I've been to a few inaugurations, and the only one I've been to where the outgoing president wasn't there was that one. You know, and another thing is so incredible. The first inauguration I went to was in 2008. And of course, that was George Bush, a transfer of power to Barack Obama. And the ceremony that I remember most vividly was not what happened on the dais in the taking of the oath by President Obama. It was after. The president takes his oath. Following that, he comes into the building, the Capitol, and there's a dinner with legislative leaders and others, the guests of the president. And a lot of fanfare, a lot of people around. But after all that happens, on the East Steps, the president and First Lady, the Vice President, and the Second Lady at that time walk down the steps just themselves. And on each step is a uniformed military person from each one of the service branches. And there's not people out there. There's some press far away so they can record this. But my wife, Margaret, and I were out there watching, and I got a pretty good view because I was a member of Congress then. And they have the ceremony where the branches of the military, each of them, wears a uniform that goes back to when that branch of the service was originated. And they have a solemn parade past the president, the newly elected president. He's been president for an hour or 2 hours. And it's a beautiful thing to see military march when they do it in formation. And each branch comes by, and as they get right across from the president, who may be 100 feet away, they all turn and salute. And I just thought, this is a miracle that we have a country where at 11:59 a.m., all of those people who just marched by, their allegiance was to the then president, President Bush. In 12:01, their allegiance is to the newly elected president, at that time, President Obama. And what is so moving to me is the power of this democracy that we have, where these magnificent, wonderful people who serve in the military, who make this choice to serve, respect the constitutional order that ultimately the power belongs to the people. The person they elect is the commander-in-chief, and their allegiance is not just to that person, that newly elected president, it's to the constitutional right that the people are in charge, not a military. We take it for granted here because it's been there since George Washington. But that's not the way it works in so many parts of the world. If there's turmoil that's political, in many parts of the world, the military steps in and they take over. But this incredibly durable strength of our democracy, where it's civilian control of the military, is a testament. And I witnessed that then, and I witnessed it again in the inauguration of President Trump, although that parade, because of the weather, had to be downstairs in the Capitol Visitor Center. But what made that happen? What made that happen is not just that the military has that respect for the Constitution, they certainly do, but because all of our leaders, all of our elected presidents understood that there was a tradition we had here that was absolutely vital to maintain and preserve, and that's the peaceful transfer of power. That's to accept the outcome of an election. And we've had close elections. That one wasn't a particularly close election. Just think of Bush v. Gore. It whole came down to a few votes, hanging chads in Florida, and ultimately a Supreme Court decision. A lot of us disagree with that decision, but Vice President Gore then accepted the outcome of the election, including the role that the court played in that. So we've had, and there's enormous heartache for the losing side. But what all of us have experienced is the pain of defeat. Maybe not all of us, but most of us, and if you haven't experienced it yet, it's waiting for you. And sometimes it can be an ambition that's thwarted. Sometimes it can be your health that's compromised. But if we're fortunate, then we understand you get set back, you lose, you pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and you get back in and fight again. In my political life, I've lost 2 elections. And it is, it is a big deal when you put yourself out, whether it's running for office or trying to get a job, and you get set back. But it's universal, it's there. But in politics, it's not so much about you losing an election. What's really critical is that we don't lose our democracy. And each of us has an obligation, when we win or when we lose, to move on. And if we lost, we get a chance to fight another day. And that's what we all knew. You lose an election, Democrats lose, Republicans lose, you come back, run again, your party runs again, and you got a shot to get the support of the American people. January 6th shattered that. And the lingering effects of January 6th are still here. Because as we know, President Trump never acknowledged that he lost that election and Joe Biden won. And a big part of his comeback was a continuation of, quote, the big steal. And it's really a danger to our democracy that now, emboldened by his win, and he won, okay? He won the popular vote this time. He won the electoral vote. His boast that it was a landslide is totally false. It was about 1.5 point margin of victory. We're a divided country. A Lincoln-esque kind of president would acknowledge the obvious. It was a close call for the American people that he won, but his job is to represent everybody, whether they voted for him or not. And I think, all of us in the Senate, Mr. President, if we won, we're here, we're really happy that we got the approval of the people we represent. But I think all of us know that whether people voted for us or not, I have an obligation to everybody in Vermont, as you do to everybody in Wyoming. They have a right to be heard. And what we're getting, I think, is a version of leadership at this point that rejects that. So where we are now, and it's very regrettable, is we've got an administration that is talking about going after people that they perceive as political adversaries. And that'll have real effects. We had hearings about them on Judiciary, Mr. President, and on the Finance Committee. And in the Judiciary Committee, we heard from Pam Bondi, the nominee and now Attorney General, and Kash Patel, who we have not voted on yet, but the FBI director. And in the case of Pam Bondi, I was very impressed with her. She's a quite accomplished person, Attorney General in the county that she grew up in Florida, and then she had the gumption to run a statewide race in the 3rd biggest state of our country, and she won that to be Attorney General. By all accounts, did a really good job. But one of the questions that she was asked, Mr. Patel was asked, and others have been asked, is the simple question: who won the election in 2020? And President Trump cannot tolerate anyone acknowledging that Biden won. So the standard answer now that they go through in their preparation for their hearings is that President Biden was the president, or he was certified. But they can't say, because it would infuriate President Trump, that he lost or that the other guy won. Now, why is that so worrisome to me? Because it's a continuation of the denial of the decision the American people made. And it's an indication of a demand of fealty that the president is imposing on people who are going to be in very important positions. In law enforcement, where an attorney general and FBI director have enormous power to prosecute, and where aggression is a good quality, you want to be ambitious and hard and work hard for the American people, bring lawbreakers to justice. But restraint is also extraordinarily important in those positions, because the power you have by bringing a prosecution is the power to ruin the life of a person. So there has to be great caution and reservation and restraint in folks who have that awesome power. And my take on the insistence by the president that an individual that's going to serve him not acknowledge who won the 2020 election is an indication that first and foremost, the president's demanding fealty to him as opposed to fealty to the Constitution. Now, we're in the first whirlwind weeks of a new presidency. And I'm alarmed. I'm alarmed at what appears to be a disregard for the law on the part of President Trump. Number one, the order the president sent out impounding money that was appropriated by Congress is a direct challenge to the institutional responsibility and authority of the United States Senate in the United States Congress. Under our Constitution, Article 1, the Congress has the power of the purse. The Congress decides how to raise money. The Congress decides how to spend money. We had a president in the past who tried to end run that and take away the power that the Congress has. And that, of course, was President Nixon. And the court found what he did illegal. And Congress passed the Impoundment Act to prohibit the president from doing that, although allowing a president to come before Congress to seek a revision in an appropriation that we made. That's the way to do it. This Impoundment Act cut across all levels of government and completely rejected the authority of Congress. Now, some people may not care about that. Let the president decide. So why is it really important? Just as the peaceful transfer of power has been a hallmark of our democracy and has served us well, the system of checks and balances of three branches of government, co-equal, where ambition is challenged by ambition, in the words of one of our great legal philosophers. And what that meant was you have an ambitious executive, that's fine, but you have an ambitious Congress where it knows its role is to protect the interests of the people that we represent and assert our authority and stand up for the rights of the people we represent if there's an overreach of executive authority. So we've got the three branches, and there's a tug of war oftentimes. But the last thing in the world any of us can do, in my view, as United States senators, is to abdicate our responsibility under the Constitution to be a separate branch of government. For me, that would be a violation of my oath. And where you have a direct challenge by the executive, as you do with the Impoundment Act, that memo that the president sent out, basically picking and choosing which appropriations he's okay with and which he isn't. That's a direct challenge to the authority of the Congress. And as I say, this is not about us individually needing authority. It's about good governance. It's about the constitutional principles of how, as a large and diverse country, we navigate the political questions that have to be addressed in every generation. Questions about war and peace. That we do everything that is within our power to protect that separation of powers and stand up for the institutional responsibilities of the United States Senate. You know, that the other aspect of this that's very disturbing to me is reminiscent of my experience when I was in the gallery with that police officer, that young man who wanted to go home to his family and who was now in enormous jeopardy, if not physically, the trauma of what he had to experience and what may have been required of him to do. There's a kind of callousness to that on the part of the attackers, where he's just erased. His feelings don't matter. Whether he gets home with the milk that he promised to bring, whether he gets there to pick up his child at soccer, doesn't matter to them. What reminds me of that is the impact of this impoundment and what it did to everyday people. And of course, I'm talking the impoundment, but also I'm talking about the letter that went out telling people who were working in countries like Malawi. They're working for us with USAID. They're working in Rwanda. They're working in Ethiopia. They're providing food to people who are starving. They're providing vaccines to people who may be sick. They're teaching young girls. I was in Malawi with Senator Murray, and this young, beautiful young woman, young girl really, she's probably 12 years old, at a school that USAID had put up. She came up to Senator Murray, threw her arms around her, and just thanked her that there was this school. She could go to school. But this letter went out, an email. You wake up, open up your inbox, and it says, you no longer work. You're done. How cruel is that? It's cruel to this person, a U.S. aid worker, whose life is to serve. That's why they're in USA. That's why they're in USAID. They get gratification from serving. You take that away from them. But then think about that young girl who threw her arms around Senator Murray and is thrilled. Here she is in Malawi. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. And she is thrilled that she's reading, that she's thinking maybe I could be a doctor. She's thinking that she can have a big life and be independent. And that teacher who has been showing up for the past several months doesn't appear. And there's no explanation to her. That's happened in country after country after country, in aid project after aid project after aid project. So there's a cruelty here that is just, it's just bad for us. I mean, that's not how we treat one another, no matter how much we disagree on politics. So that actually makes me sad about what's happening. You know, there's really large issues here that affect us. I was listening to Senator Murphy, and I thought he made some really terrific points, about our democracy, about what dynamic is happening here with this new administration, about the wealth transfer that's happening. And, I'll give President Trump this. He did tap into a lot of heartache and a lot of anxiety and a lot of concern that people around the country had. They didn't like the way things were going, and they felt, I think, economically, they weren't getting ahead despite working really hard. I think that's something that he tapped into. And I think to some extent, we Democrats did not do the job on the securing of the southern border, in as much as we did with many of the initiatives, economic initiatives of the last administration. There's a reality that confronts all of us, Republicans and Democrats, that if you're a young family and you're trying to buy a house that's out of reach, the health care that you used to be able to count on is getting incredibly expensive. The cost of child care for young families, it's like going to college. I mean, these things are really tough on people. And we've got to address them. But those challenges that I just mentioned, they're in all America. It's not like that's just red America or blue America. You talk to a family in Vermont. You talk to a family probably in Wyoming or Idaho or Ohio. The challenges they face are very similar. And what that suggests to me, Mr. President, is that the problems that we face, that the people we represent face, those are real. And in a campaign, we can argue about who has the better prescription to address them. And you won that campaign last time. You did. And by the way, I can say Donald Trump won the election. I don't like to say it, but I can say it, and I should say it because he did. But now is a time where the focus we have together should be to try to solve those problems, that make life better for everyday people in your state and in mine. But if you listen to the inaugural speech of President Trump, I didn't hear any words about housing. I didn't hear any words about child care. I didn't hear any words about clean air. I didn't hear any words about strengthening rural hospitals. All those things that we share in common and our real challenges, they weren't talked about. The big emphasis was on these tax cuts. And, those tax cuts will help some everyday people, some of them, but an immense amount of the allocation of those tax cuts is going to go to folks who are doing really well, and our corporations that are doing really well. And those tax cuts are going to come and be paid for by cutting into some of the services the government provides through the private sector oftentimes to the citizens in every one of our states. And Senator Murphy went through a lot of those. I mean, the House is now taking the lead on this tax bill. They're trying to come up with ways to cut the spending in order to pay for the tax cuts. And Medicare is in jeopardy. Medicaid is in jeopardy. Child care, to the extent we help, is in jeopardy. So there's a real wealth transfer that has been built into this major agenda item. The other aspect of this that is disturbing to me is just the impact that it has on people in Vermont. And there's a lot of turmoil for our businesses and for our service providers. Let me just talk about some of the effects of these across-the-board cuts that the president is talking about and how it would affect Vermont. It would freeze funding for Head Start. And as you know, that's like 1,200 kids in Vermont. It really makes a difference in them getting off to a decent start. And it's poorer kids, oftentimes don't have the nutrition that they need. And a lot of these kids, with the benefit of Head Start, go on to become very successful people. A freeze in funding for community health centers. You know, when the administration sent out that directive saying, really freezing funding, one of the community health centers we have is the Wells River Health Center, Community Health Center. And I was talking to the director, and they provide health care for people in what we call the Northeast Kingdom, and it's a very low-income part of our state. Very, very hardworking and proud people. And they have an operating cash margin of like 0 to 5 days. So when the funding is cut off, and of course the website to get payments for the website to find out what was going on was closed down, just unilaterally. Something Mr. Vought thinks is a good idea. When that happened, the director was in an incredible bind. He had workers who were showing up. He had moms who were bringing their kids in for a dental appointment they've been trying to get for 7 months. He had support staff that had been working there for years. And with this directive, they couldn't pay the bills. Okay, so I'm not even quite sure what their status is right now, but that directive imposed on the director of the program this horrible decision where he had no capacity to have any confidence whatsoever that he could meet payroll. So why would you do that? You know, if you have a plan where you're saying, hey, we're spending too much money, we've got to figure out how to tighten our belts, and then you take some time to have a plan, there's some consultation with the agency and the people who are affected, that's a responsible way to proceed. But just a bolt out of the blue, you open up your inbox and you're told you're shutting down, and then the ripple effects that has in a community. And then, of course, people who work there have to make their plans because they can't wait indefinitely to get the decision as to whether they will or won't have a job, whether the community health center will stay open or it'll close. There's a lot of destruction that goes into an action that the administration took with that. You know, we had a couple of round tables because people were really, really stressed and calling all of our offices. And we're a small state like you are, Mr. President. And you know, one of the privileges that I think you and I both have is being a senator in a small state. We really get to know an awful lot of the people we represent. And I know I've talked to you about this, and the great joy we get is in that interaction with the folks we represent. And that's whether we agree with them or not, whether they voted for us or not. But it also makes it a little more painful because it's very real, it's not abstract. So I'll just tell a few stories about some of the Vermonters that got affected. Sarah Robinson with the Vermont Network Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. She said, federal funding in Vermont supports emergency shelter and hotline services for victims of domestic and sexual violence. They get a call in the middle of the night. It's a woman who's getting battered, and they respond. They have a network of volunteers that go out and they'll they'll bring that woman to safety, and they'll have a safe house for her. That's a pretty amazing service, and suddenly that's cut off. Andy Barter from the Little Rivers Healthcare Center That's the one I was talking about earlier up in Wells River. He said, "This has been a week like none other that threatened the continuation of our health center and operations that has dearly affected the feeling of safety for our staff and patients." You know, you get these local institutions, they're so important to everyday people. You count on being able to bring your daughter, your son, to the doctor and somebody you know. I mean, again, Mr. President, I have such respect for you and admiration in your career as a physician and the healing that you do, and I know, you know, the joy you get in that service. But suddenly, we've got doctors who have that same ethic that you have in Vermont, and suddenly the people that depended on them can't go there. Vermont State Representative Kate Logan works at Elevate, said, "Our agencies are serving 78 young people, youth, and if they don't get the resources, they're not going to be able to continue their services." And this is about housing and homelessness. And of course, that problem in Vermont, like in all of our states, has increased very, very significantly. Sonali Samarasinji, U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, said, "We have 79 families in temporary housing. This is very challenging for us. We don't have the funds, and it's a public safety issue because there's homelessness and we don't have the funds to go on paying their rents." I mean, this is not new funds they're seeking. This is the funds that they've been authorized and have committed. And boom, out of nowhere, they're told they're out of business. Karen Price, the Vermont Family Network, she said the executive order and the memo has thrown all of our funding that we have relied on into disarray. We suspended all of our planned activities. We talked about furloughing our employees. Cash flow for a nonprofit like the Family Network is tight. We can't sustain a prolonged non-receipt of funding. Every day since Tuesday has been filled with anxiety and uncertainty. Steve Schmida from Resonance. They do a lot of work with USAID. He told me 70% of our work is with the USAID in the State Department. Before the Secretary of State's and Secretary Marco Rubio's foreign assistance stop work order, 62 of those have now been laid off. This is in the inbox. You're not working anymore. It's no different than if we went home tonight, each one of us had a nice meal with our family, went to bed looking forward to resting and getting up and facing today, got up, and boom, in the inbox we're told, don't show up for work. So the two features that I've seen so far in this administration, it really is a continuation of the January 6th ethic, is a willingness to disregard the law, the shattering of norms, and a casual infliction of cruelty for no reason on everyday Americans who just want to keep doing the job that they have and do the work that needs to be done. So, Mr. President, I yield the balance of my time.